and how we are like that man in so many ways. Moses was a man of pain. There were all kinds of pain in his life. Think about him really as almost a homeless person. He was raised in the first half of his life. By the way, I'm going to make reference to Car Talk. Who's ever listened to the radio show Car Talk? I was afraid of that. So never mind, doesn't matter. It was an hour-long radio show Saturday mornings, right? 60 minutes. The first 20 minutes was the first half. The second 20 minutes was the second half. And the last 20 minutes was the third half. So the psalm here has actually 3 halves, so we'll look at it in 3 parts. My presentation will have a third half as well, and that will be the psalm itself. The first 2 halves will look at Moses' life, character, and death to some extent. So don't get too impatient. We really will get in the third half of the show, we'll get to the psalm itself. But the first half of Moses' life, he was raised by somebody else, not his family. Remember that? Kind of adopted. Second half, he wandered around in Midian. The third half of his life, he wandered around again with the people of Israel. Right? I'll mention this to Sewell. I guess we all reference Sewell. Everybody knows who that is. But anyway, very wise man. And he was telling about, what must it have felt like? How long does it take actually to walk from Egypt to Canaan? Maybe some weeks. I don't really know. So they get maybe 2 years in there in Kadesh. And God says, you know what? 38 more years with these people. And he had to deal with that. And how many people died along the way? 600,000 men came out of Egypt, right? And add another 600,000, I'm assuming that many women. These were people who could walk. Above 20 probably. That's important, right? How many people died during that 40 years? Over 1 million. Divide that by 40 years. Divide that by 365 days. That's 80 people a day. 80 people. You think Moses preached a few funerals? And people that he knew? And was there illness during that time?
Yeah.
Was there betrayal and threats against him?
Yes.
All the lessons up till now, maybe David in particular, are all about the situations in which I think I'm going to die. Right? Saul's just about to get me. My enemies have surrounded me. You know what this psalm is about?
I think I'm going to die.
I'm going to die. Not I think I'm going to. God told me I'm going to die. And when and where? So, and the other parts of pain, Psalm 51 comes to mind, of course, as the primary, is the pain of our own sin.
Right.
Daniel had a prayer in chapter 9 of Daniel that I think he was commanded to pray. And he kind of takes on this kind of corporate first-person plural, we have sinned and all that. There's no real recorded sin of Daniel. I don't claim he was a perfect man, but there's no particular thing you hold out in front. Was that true of Moses? Or was there one sin that was always in it? And if he ever forgot, God reminded him again. Right? That's what we're going to see. These are the sources of pain in our lives. The sin in others, the sin in ourselves, the death of those around us. The disappointed hopes. This was his goal to get to the promised land. And first of all, it got pushed out 38 years in the third half of his life. Right? And then he didn't even get there. Disappointed. In the accomplishment that perhaps was the center of his focus in the third half of his life. Okay, here's what I'd like to do. Here's an outline. And maybe I've already summarized enough that you can see where I'm going. That's Psalm 90. We will read it enough that I'm not going to read it right now. I want to put some context of Moses' character and Moses' life in our heads. But I do want to read that introductory thing, as Joe mentioned. Read that. A prayer of Moses, the man of God. We know that, by the way, no other psalm attributed to Moses. I don't know if he wrote them or not. And by the way, do you know you have to back up 500 years from David to get to Moses? This is a long time before. I think it's likely that the Hebrew language evolved over that time, that Moses maybe wrote in some proto-Hebrew, as the scholars today would call it. So maybe it got massaged and brought up to date into the language of the Psaltery, that existed in David's time. And yet these are the thoughts and the words that Moses spoke. And I'm going to try to convince you he spoke this in the very last few days of his life. And maybe that's speculation, but I think you'll see some evidence for that. You realize the whole book of Deuteronomy was kind of the last 3 or 4 days, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but a series of sermons that Moses spoke to the people before he died. But he knew that day was coming. And in that urgency of these sermons, he reviewed Israel's history. He reviewed the covenant with them. He talked about what's going to happen if you disobey and what could happen if you do obey. And he made some prophecies about there'll be a prophet like me that will come. He talked about kings that they would have in the future. And then he appointed and made sure Joshua was in place as a great leader, appointed by God, approved by God, who would actually fight all the battles, as it turns out. And then he died. He died. Moses, the man of God. So let's talk about that. I just want to introduce a little bit by Psalms of Lament. I don't know if you know this, all this stuff about the Psalms of Lament. But lament, the word itself just means complaint. I think in English we have both a noun and a verb, right? A lament is the complaint, and lament is to complain. But anyway, that's kind of the same idea. But it carries with it more than just I'm a whiner. Not like the people of Israel whined to Moses, but rather, I'm hurting. I'm crushed by this sorrow, by this circumstance. And I'm actually emotionally troubled, more than just it's a logical thing that didn't go the way I wanted it to. That's
Right.
the idea.
Right.
Let me just take a minute and change the screens here. I'm sorry for this. Okay, much better. Yeah, that's better. 40% of the Psalms are Psalms of Lament, and I put approximate on there because
Right.
some are both, and some are more than one thing, and some are kind of mostly that, but maybe also something else. But categorizing them, that's a lot of content in the Psalm that are all about being emotionally moved about things not going the way you wish. The typical, canonical, I hate to use that word, components of a Psalm of Lament are these. There's an address, so at the very beginning, you turn to God. And sometimes it's a turning, meaning I'm focus my attention to Him, or I'm turning to Him in a certain circumstance. But anyway, there's an address at the beginning. There's a statement of the complaint with often lots of details. You know, like my bones are sticking out. You know, those very specific details about the circumstance. And we'll see that in the psalm. And then there's an ask. Usually there's an ask. And finally there's praise at the end, usually. Now in this psalm, some of these are combined, but all those four elements are there. Easy to find,
Right.
Easy to see in this psalm. Okay, what do laments teach us about times of pain? That's my question. And this is kind of a general overview, but I think we've seen that in the lessons already. The first thing is that God is present. Who are you turning to if He isn't there? And so, and rather, we know He's there because of the history. Many of the songs of lament will say, hey, remember when this happened? You did good. And remember this and this? So here I am now with this new complaint, and I need to talk to you about it. The other thing is that God knows these feelings that are very real to us. And
Right.
I think it's important, too, to think that He knows it, He sympathizes, and He may have a larger purpose. I know He has a larger purpose.
Amen.
That doesn't mean He's rejoicing that we're suffering.
Amen.
His emotions are bound with ours. He is sorry. God does not rejoice in the death of His saints, is one of the Psalm quotations. There's no joy in His mind when we suffer, but there is something very important happening, and He knows it even if we don't know what that is.
Yes.
And it's an interesting thing that we're encouraged to bring those emotions to God.
Yes.
I'll say more about that in just a minute. Because in God's eyes, and in His wisdom, which is far above ours, I know I'm illogical.
Yes. Yes.
I know that.
Right.
I don't know all the facts. And I got to raise kids. And I think that was one of God's tools to help me understand how I relate to Him and how He relates to me. Little babies, they cry over the dumbest things. You know what I mean? Can we do this now? No, we'll do it in 5 minutes. Ah! Oh, I can't wait 5 minutes. And tomorrow, we talked about this yesterday, tomorrow is like never. Oh, we'll do that tomorrow. Yeah? Their sense of time is all off. Their sense of what's important is upside down. I wanted that toy. There's a whole room of toys strewn everywhere, but that one that the sister picked up first, that's the only one I wanted. And we laugh at that, but aren't we like that? And if you forget that, think of how you thought when you were younger, or less mature, or didn't see things, or hadn't gone through some things that worked out okay. How did you think about life? I don't think we're much better now than we were then. We're slowly maturing, but it's such a slow process.
Right.
And when we come to God, we're illogical. Now, I'm not saying He laughs at us.
Right.
He looks at with pity and compassion and understanding and with some larger purpose in His mind, but it's okay.
Right.
It's okay. I think raising kids, you see how what, they're twisted or upside down value systems. We just need to be, tolerant. I'm not going to get into the parenting thing, but it's a real emotion with them. We don't ever deny that. We just think, well, they're just not adults yet. They haven't figured that out. And I think God must look at us that way.
Yes.
And He knows we're illogical. He knows we overreact with our emotions. He knows we're immature. He knows we're anxious when we shouldn't be, and about 100 other weaknesses that we have. And yet, He allows us to come. He has a plan that we can't see. He exists outside time, so when we're impatient, and God says tomorrow, and we think that means never, no, He has a time scale. And that's what He's working at. And He's kind of always on time, in the perfect time, which we, of course, don't know. So He does here. He doesn't rebuke us if we're filled with faith in our pleading, however illogical, emotional, and all those other things we are. And often our suffering really is the result of our personal sin or our unreasonable expectations. Hope deferred makes the heart sick comes to mind. You know what I mean? We build our hopes up. Well, now whose fault was that when it didn't turn out that way?
Right. Right.
And how much of our discomfort and anxiety and other kinds of suffering are a result of our own sin.
Right.
And yet, Psalm 51, David comes to God. Whose fault is it David was in that mess? And yet God welcomes that emotional appeal. So our laments, like all prayer, should allow us then to improve our perceptions and our priorities.
Right.
And so maybe in our laments, and you'll certainly see this in Psalm 90, we should be saying, I know your time is not our time. I know your plan is not our plan. And I know I'm not that important in the larger scheme of the whole world and its plan and all that. But I'm still hurting.
Yes.
Help me. And I praise you for all those times that you've helped me in the past. And I anticipate that that will happen. Okay, I think we're done. So, what we'll talk about next is Moses' character. And this is amazing. I'm going to begin at the end. All right? But since then, these are the last words in Deuteronomy. Who wrote Deuteronomy? Kind of a trick question. Who wrote Genesis? Exodus? Leviticus? Numbers? Deuteronomy, yeah. Yeah, Moses wrote all that. And he wrote it to the children of Israel because they didn't have a clue what the world was about. Or what men were. How were they created? How are they different from animals? And men and women, and what were they? How did they relate to each other? Right? And what happened in the history of the world all through the ages, and how did God interact with it? And who was this man Abraham we say is our father? And where is this place we're going, Canaan? And what happened to some of those cities that are there? Where Melchizedek came out from Salem, or a well was dug, or a dream was had of a ladder up to heaven. The Israelites needed to know all that because that's where they were going. And that whole history in Genesis, and by the way, how did we get to Egypt in slavery? How did that happen? He explains all that. And then, more recent history and their experience, the Israelites, remember how we got out of Egypt. The power demonstrated in the plagues and Pharaoh's armies drowned in the Red Sea. Remember that? So you can just imagine this whole history is written for the Israelites to see who they were and why they deserved to go into Canaan and take that land as the promise. So that's the context. Who wrote all those books again? Yes, but I don't think he wrote this. The end of the book of Deuteronomy. But since then, since when? Since Moses died, right. Since then, there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom Yahweh, just side note on this, it kind of is a little bit important in the psalm to notice the difference between the Adonai word, which is translated Lord in most translations, and the Yahweh word, which is translated Lord in most translations. So, but it does make a difference. And you know, the second one was the name that actually was refreshed or perhaps revealed to Moses at the burning bush. When Moses says, "Who are you?" which God are you? Maybe, I don't know, he didn't say. But, and the answer was Yahweh, I am. And so that's a kind of a name especially associated with Moses. Interesting to think about that. Right? Anyway, sorry to be so slow. Whom Yahweh knew face to face. There has not arisen a prophet whom Yahweh knew face. In all the signs and wonders which Yahweh sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land. And by all that mighty power and great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. So I suspect this was appended to the book by inspiration. I'm not questioning that at all. By someone looking back and actually making a transition to the next page in my Bible, which is Joshua, who takes over. And the first thing said just about is, Moses is dead. It's on you. Be strong and courageous. Things like that. So it makes that transition. But think about the significance of this statement with regard to Moses. Who was he? What kind of a man was he? I think this is a good thing. We often point to him as being a reluctant, frightened, insecure guy when he says, I don't think I'm the right guy to lead these people out of Egypt. I'm really not very eloquent. Now, we're going to look at this psalm and other songs in Exodus 15 and 32 and 3. He must have improved his literacy a lot over those 40 years, I guess. You know, but anyway, somehow he did pretty well in terms of his speaking ability. But I don't think it's a bad thing for us to be aware of our limitations, right? And to be reluctant to be the guy who's in front, right? Who gets the big name, who gets to be the leader and all of that. In our world, though, you think, well, I'm not going to get what I deserve if I'm not represented in leadership. Moses was reluctant on that. No, I'm not sure I'm qualified to do this great work. And God gave him some help. Besides God himself, with Aaron and others. But he was confident in God's power. You know that incident where they're at the Red Sea. Here comes Pharaoh's army. Remember that. And the Israelites, not that they hadn't already complained about bricks and everything else, but this is like not good news if they start complaining right away. But really, maybe they have a case. I'm sorry, I'm writing that. Maybe they have a case. There's a sea, a Red Sea. There's Pharaoh's army. What are we going to do? And they say, not for the last time. I wish we'd stayed in Egypt and died there, as slaves instead of coming here and perish in the wilderness, right? You'll hear that again over and over. And Moses, this is before God says, stretch out your hand. He says, really by faith. God hadn't told him what was going to happen. I don't think he's any more aware of what the solution is than anybody else. Stand still and see the salvation of Yahweh.
Yes.
Now, did he know what was going to happen? I don't know if he did or not. But wow, what a measure of faith he got. Well, of course, he had the plagues and some other things to help him grow that way. And then, of course, God came through, if you want to say it that way, as if we had any doubt about that. And then when the Pharaoh's army was destroyed, he was a worship leader. And I think all of God's leaders, whatever they are not just decision makers and order givers. They're worship leaders too. And that may be the first thing we need to be as God's leaders. Exodus 15 is the song that Moses wrote and led, I suppose, after the defeat of Pharaoh's armies. I just want to point out one thing for you to stick in your head, and maybe it will be useful later on. He talks about the horse and rider cast into the sea, which Miriam echoes a little bit later. But down in verse 13 in that song, Exodus 15, if I haven't said that, he says, you in your mercy have led forth the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them in your strength to your holy habitation. Where were they? Verse 17. You will bring them in and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance. Okay, I get that. In the place, O Lord, which you have made for your own dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. I mentioned before Moses mostly lived as a homeless guy.
Yep.
And now what was he doing with these children of Israel? Yanking them out of Egypt, which really wasn't their home either.
Right.
But now they're just literally in the wilderness. But where does he say God has brought them? into a dwelling place. And I just want to plant in your minds that that is a theme of the Bible, you know.
Yes. Yes.
God walked with Adam and Eve in the garden, and someday in the future we'll be in the real garden of heaven where we're with God and have that fellowship of true family, home. But you know, all between, what was the tabernacle about? What was the temple about? It's God dwelling with us. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that word in the Greek is so significant. It keeps showing up, right? In my Father's house are many dwelling places. Abiding places is the idea. Abide in me, and I in you. I am the vine, you're the branches. Abide in me. This idea of dwelling with God is a theme of the Bible. Being at home. I'm sorry, this is maybe more Southern thinking. I don't know. I'm impressed with you people up here because I think most of you are not home. Maybe you are. Y'all know what I mean by that? In some earthly sense. People rent more up here. I think it may be a virtue, I'm not sure. But you know, people have come from other countries, I can tell. And I don't mean this in any insulting way, but you've got the feeling in your heart about what it's like not to be at home.
Right. Right.
With a capital H, perhaps. Anyway, keep that theme in your head. He was a worship leader. He was a diligent judge. Perhaps to prepare him for all those laws God was going to give, God let him try to settle some of these matters with all those Israelites who couldn't get along with one another, who had probably wronged one another, who probably didn't have much sense of morality or civility because of their background as slaves in Egypt and observing the Egyptian civilization. I don't really know, but God put him through that. Dawn till dusk. Jethro said, "This will kill you if you keep trying to do this all by yourself." So and you know, to his credit, he actually took advice from an older, wiser man, not even an Israelite, who knew a better plan to handle the situation. And not only that, he delegated a lot of those things that he might have tried to do all by himself to good men who had good character. He said, this is a better way to get God's will done. All those are great things for a leader to remember. And he was meek. I guess he wrote it about himself. He was the meekest of all men. But you know, the context of that was when his leadership was threatened. I think by relatives even. And you know how he responded, especially in the situation with Korah and Dathan and Abiram and those guys? They basically were insulting him. They said some pretty cruel things about his leadership, about his motives, about his success, or lack of it, given where they were. Moses fell down on the ground with his face to the ground. I guess they could understand what he was saying. And he said, God's going to sort this out tomorrow. So he wasn't defensive of his own capabilities. So you can think about these situations where there was murmuring and there was a insurrection, I don't know what else you want to call it, against his leadership. The other thing, the opposite side of that, I don't know if you remember that incident where some of the elders were given some of the spirit of Moses, apparently perhaps to give him some relief, and that was good. But then there was two of them, Eldad and Medad, who kept on prophesying. And Joshua, concerned to I see some people nodding. I don't know how much detail to go into these stories. Maybe they're just, anyway.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm going to tell the story. Remember, I've got three halves of this lesson. So, Eldad and Medad kept prophesying. Joshua was concerned to protect Moses' authority, leadership. He comes running to Moses and he says, those guys, they're still prophesying in the camp. You know how Moses reacted? I wish that all the Israelites had that gift. He was pleased that other people had talents and abilities to contribute. And it didn't threaten his leadership or his identity or his self-image or any of those things. That's the kind of man he was. He often interceded sacrificially for the people. I hope you know that, right? I mean, the golden calf is the one that comes to mind, maybe the premier example. You remember what Moses told God? God said, that's it, I'm gone. I'm destroying them. What did Moses say? Blot my name out of the book of life instead of these people. Does that sound familiar? Taking the curse for himself. You know what's interesting? It seems like he was batting 1,000 on that too. He did it more than once. And every time he was successful in turning God's heart back to preserve the people. Go with them into the land. Wow. What character that must represent with his ability to be successful in his appeals to God. And he's called a king in some ways over. Maybe he's a better example of what a king would have been. He's called a king in Jeshurun in that poem in chapter 33. 2 more songs he wrote. 32 was one right near the end of his life, which was kind of like blessings and cursings related. 33 was like a love letter, where each tribe is called out and given a picture of that tribe. So 2 other songs Moses wrote. What was his relationship with God? Well, it was very special. Special meaning no one else had it. We saw that already in that last chapter of Deuteronomy. He was personally called by God. God spoke to him mouth to mouth. That's said a couple of times. Exodus 33 and Numbers 12. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. He asked and he granted. By the way, your translation may say face to face. But I'll get to that in just a second. He asked and he was granted to see God's glory. I don't understand that passage. Don't ask me to explain what he saw or whatever. It was limited, no doubt.
Right.
And do you remember what happened after he saw God and interacted with God?
Right.
He walked around glowing,
Right.
right? Showing the glory of God in his own person itself. And he was called a faithful servant. Now I want to read about that situation where Miriam and Aaron were kind of, threatening his leadership or complaining that they were just as good as he was or whatever. And God, it's just like they're complaining. And again, Moses this time didn't have to fall on the ground and say, God, okay. God came like, listen, and it's like whoa. And so God just came in and intervened in that situation. And he said this about Moses: if there is a prophet among you, that's Yahweh, make myself known to him in a vision. And there have been dreams in the Old Testament, right? Quite a few. You can think of Joseph. Abraham had a dream. Jacob had a dream. There were a lot of those things. And sometimes they were kind of puzzling and had to be interpreted. And, they were kind of, right? But not so with my servant Moses. He's faithful in all my house. I'll stop there and say the Hebrew writer plays on that phrase, Moses is a servant or slave in my house, my home. He lives in my home. He's a faithful servant. And of course the Hebrew writer plays on that and say, what if you were the son in that house? That might be important, but that's not where we're going. But that's kind of Moses' tagline. We heard already today that Abraham was the friend of God and David was a man after God's own heart. Moses, called by the Hebrew writer as well, and God gives him this title here, is the faithful servant in God's house. In God's house. Amen. And I speak with him face to face or mouth to mouth. The Hebrew literally is this: peh el peh. Say that with me. Peh el peh. Do you hear breathing in that?
Yeah.
And the word kind of is the word for mouth, but it has some onomatopoeia, which means the word sounds a little bit like the sound it makes. Do you hear that breath? God and Moses spoke breath to breath. Kind of an interesting way to think about that. There's an image in that. We just remember it for the song. And even plainly, and not in dark sayings, and he sees the form of Yahweh. Now I'm going to launch into some speculation here. Just tolerate it. The whole lesson doesn't depend on it. But you remember when Moses went on the mount to receive the instructions about the tabernacle? The Hebrew writer refers to this too in chapter 8. And God says, see to it you do all things according to the pattern which you received on the mountain. Right? You think there's more to that than just saying, well, it's 40 feet this way and 8 feet this way, and it's made out of this material, and by the way, there's an incense thing, and then there's a veil, and behind the veil is the most holy place. You think God explained a little more about what that meant to Moses? Not in dark sayings, right, but plainly. Maybe, here's what this means. And here's where it's going, by the way.
Right.
There's an outer court. And then there's a holy place. And then there's a most holy place. And all of that. And all this, embroideries and all that. I don't really know. But I'm going to put this question. Was God saying more to Moses than just here's the material you make it out of? And the dimensions and so on. And I think the Hebrew writer's kind of saying that because what's he saying in chapter 8? Right. It is important for Moses to make it according to the pattern because the pattern was the real thing behind it. And you need to know that. And it's important to have that in our heads. So, possibility. And the other thing, we talked about the fact that he revealed the history of it. Roger, this thing lowered when I hit it. You were hitting it pretty hard.
He hit the other one. He hit the
Oh,
wrong
he was
one.
doing this one. Okay, I'll try to hit this one.
It's going to be this tall when you get it.
He's not going to see his nose.
Yeah, I mean, Moses started with Adam. Well, even before that, right? In the beginning. And he brought him up to there, to Deuteronomy, plains of Moab, about to enter the land. Did he tell anything about what was going to happen in the future? A lot. Starting in the very first story, we said the seed of woman, the seed of the serpent are going to be an enmity. That battle's going to go on, and he's going to bruise his head, and he'll bruise his heel. Remember all that? That's in the first 3 chapters of Moses' history of Israel. Any of those promises to Abraham looking to the future that Moses never saw? The land, the people, the blessing to all the earth. I'm taking too long with all this, but I hope I'm making the point.
Yeah.
There'll be a prophet like me, and if you don't listen to him, God will hold you accountable. Remember that? Moses says that. Prophesying of the Messiah to come. Yeah, Moses didn't just reveal the history of how they were, why they were there. He revealed what's coming and what does the future hold. To some extent, for us at least, in dark sayings, but clearly prophecies for the future. All right. We're in the second half right now. Moses' death. Numbers 20. You probably know this too, but I feel obligated to explain it. The history of the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land is mostly in Exodus and in Numbers. All right? Leviticus is mostly law, except for maybe Nadab and Abihu and some other narratives. But for the most part, it's in Exodus. Well, Exodus has other stuff like the 10 Commandments and a lot of other things about the law. And Numbers, as you might guess, has some other stuff like Numbers. Right? And also geography. Where did they go and where did they go along the way and that kind of. But in between all that extra information, there's story. Story about Moses and the Israelites as they pass from Egypt through the wanderings and get themselves to the, and y'all want to say the plains of Moab. That's at Jordan Valley, right? Promised land over here. Edom, Moab, Ammon, all over here. That's where Deuteronomy ends, right? So that's. But Numbers 27 probably gets us right up to that day or days in which Deuteronomy was written. Okay? And it's after Miriam and Aaron have died, which, by the way, came kind of probably prematurely as a result of their rebellion as well. But anyway, God, the Lord, that's Yahweh, said to Moses, go up into this mount, Abarim maybe is the way to say it, but that's a mountain range that's over there on the east side of Jordan, right? And in that range, there's a place called Nebo or Pisgah, which has several events related to that. But anyway, go up to this Mount of Abarim and see the land which I have given to you, the children of Israel. So he's supposed to go up here and look over here, over to the west, and see Canaan. And when you've seen it, you shall be gathered to your people as Aaron your brother was gathered. I might just mention that Aaron had probably died a few weeks or months, maybe more before, and Aaron too climbed up a mountain. And he went up there with Eleazar, is that right? His son. And he took off his clothes and he put them on his son. And he died. And they came back down, and the text actually is interesting. It says, in the sight of Israel, he's gone. Interesting. They saw him go up, they didn't see him come back. They knew he was dead. And so, anyway, that similar to that. But anyway, he's making a reference to that story. He says, when you've seen it, you'll be gathered to your people as Aaron, your brother, was. But this, by the way, this picture, if you can see it, is an actual view from Pisgah or Nebo. And what you can see, you can kind of see the Jordan Valley in here, and then the mountains beyond over in the western side where the land of Canaan was. If you look at this verse, Deuteronomy 31:2, and also in verse 22 and in 32:48, it seems like there was actually a last day. Deuteronomy is organized, it seems like by sermons somewhat. But this seems to indicate that starting in chapter 31, it's the last day. The very same day is the language used. The very same day as what? As he died. The very last day. Well, I mean, I try to put, if you woke up in the morning and the voice of God said, your last day, how would that feel? Or what would you do? I mean, you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
What a significant time that was. And I mentioned before, David thinks, I think I might die in this. No, Moses is going to die on that day. And God says, here's exactly what we're going to do. And you know, interesting, Moses' first reaction was actually to make sure that the Israelites who were sheep would not be sheep without a shepherd.
Yeah.
Again, a kind of messianic reference. Well, who's going to lead them? I think he knew Joshua was the successor. I guess he knew. But he wanted to be sure. And he then, once he figured that out, he had a role in making sure Joshua was recognized among the people. And so in the end, he kind of says, okay, I'm not relevant anymore. I can't go in and come out. And by the way, I don't think that means he was feeble.
Right.
Right? Because he's going to climb 200-story mountain, on his last day. It wasn't like he was infirm and couldn't walk. That just means he's not the leader that goes out ahead of the people and brings them back in. That's what it's saying. And now he says Joshua will go out and come in. That's the idea. I don't know. We're talking about processing pain. I will tell you, by the way, just so you know, this psalm references somebody who's 70 or by reason of strength 80, right? I just turned 70 a week ago. So here I am. Maybe I'll make it or maybe I won't. But I kind of know that feeling when you get older and you're not really qualified to do the things you did before.
Yeah.
And that's an adjustment. It can be painful if we don't have the right attitude. That is, that God is doing all this stuff for me anyway.
Right. Right.
But you got to adjust to that. Not you younger folk, right? But at some point in your life, you say, yeah, I'm not as relevant. I'm not going to be able to do that much longer, and I can't even do what I used to do before. And Moses kind of says that. And so he says, so here's Joshua, your new leader, but he's not going to be the one that fights your battles. It's not him. It's God.
That's right.
So don't worry about it. But anyway, he acknowledges the new leader. And he made teaching and provisions like remembering the law, including the fact that every 7 years, he says in this text, I want you to come together and read the law. Wow, it's getting violent here. I want you to come together and read the law to remind not only you, but your children. And I'm thinking every 7 years is about right. A kid learns, to kind of understand what's being read at maybe 7, so another 7 years, they're still not adults, but they get to hear it again. That's just me talking. But anyway, he made provision for that. You remember in Deuteronomy 6, he worried about children and grandchildren in terms of knowing and keeping the law carefully. And then there was a public event inaugurating Joshua. And so that's the go out and go in passage we saw before. And then he wrote a songs of blessings and warnings, 32, for a guy who couldn't speak very well. Pretty nice place to put a song. And then he wrote a love letter, a blessing for each tribe in chapter 33. And then he climbed Nebo, Pisgah, and he viewed God's promises fulfilled. I'll come back to that because I think he was given a God's eye view, and we'll talk about that. But right here, see that? That's where God spoke and said, get up and go and climb Mount Nebo and die. So that'll be where we read from. Now back in Numbers 27, which may be a kind of a parallel account, here we are. The Lord said to Moses, go up to this Mount Abarim, see the land which I've given you. When you've seen it, you shall be gathered to your people as Aaron, your brother, was gathered. I didn't put the next verse, but I want you to read it. 4. In the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, no excuse. You rebelled against my command to hallow me at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah, Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin. Really? That's all he did? And he's going to have to go up and die before he leads the people in the promised land and finish his life's ambition and his purpose? Really? What was the sin? Go back to chapter 20. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, take the rod. I guess I wish he had told him, leave the rod behind this time. Right? But I don't really think that's what got him in trouble. You and your brother Aaron gather the congregation together, speak to the rock before their eyes. It will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock to give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod from before Yahweh as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels. Was that true? Mm-hmm. Were they rebels? I don't think his sin was insulting God's people. I think he's right. Must we bring water for you out of this rock? Now we're in trouble. Then Moses lifted his hand and he struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly. You know, I don't know. I guess I've always thought God said, speak, and he struck the rock with the rod. I don't know. I mean, from one point of view, water came out and everything was fine. What's wrong with that, right? And Moses had said, be careful to do all that the Lord has commanded. I understand that too. But that's really not what God makes a reference to when he condemns him almost instantly, right? And the congregation and their animals drank. Then the Lord, here's another one, Moses. Kind of like with the Miriam and Aaron situation. Because you did not believe me to hallow me, that means make me holy. Treat me as special in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Oh. Do you think it's possible there were any other people there who were not hallowing God adequately? Like maybe everybody else? And yet he didn't say to them, you can't go in the promised land. This was the very group that probably would. And maybe the best generation under Joshua's leadership in terms of the conquest and so on. What did Moses do here? So he didn't make God holy, but it was in the eyes of the people. Do you see that? What's different about that? And I think as a leader you have to think, and a leader, I mean moms, and I mean teachers of kids, and I mean people who speak and preach and maybe live an example of godliness or not in front of their neighbors. That leadership, if we're not hallowing God in our life, showing his holiness in the way we live, that's what Moses did wrong. He acted like somehow it was his thing, and God, was not treated as special and transcendent and the guiding force. And he says, this was the waters of Meribah, because the children of Israel continued with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them. So it turned out all right in the end. Why did it turn out all right in the end? In what sense was God made holy? I thought he just said, you didn't treat me as holy. Can you answer that?
By punishing Moses.
By punishing Moses. Do you see that? When Moses did that in the eyes of the people, and God said, I think in the eyes of the people, okay, you can't go in the promised land. There's some sense in which Moses' punishment stood in the place of the people's punishment. That's kind of familiar. It rhymes if it's not quite the shadow and prophecy. You understand what I mean?
Yes.
That is, somebody's punishment stood in the place of somebody else's punishment. But I think that's the best way to understand this incident. It seems like something happened. I think it's they try to go through Edom. Is it Edom? Yeah, and Edom says you got to go around. And the people fell apart, of course, later and rebelled about that. But in any case, after that incident, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the Mount Hor by the border of the land of Egypt, said, Aaron will be gathered to his people. He shall not enter the land which I have given to the children of Israel. Because why? Because you rebelled against my word by the water of Meribah. So he's bringing it up again at the death of Aaron. And I think Aaron was suffering the consequences just like Moses was. And so that was right there. You didn't hallow me at the waters before their eyes. Do you see that continuing reference to you did this in public? You did this in a place where people would be influenced by what you said and what you did. I think that's the key. Later, in Deuteronomy, and probably not much later, but at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, in the first sermon, Moses is just kind of going through the history, and a key incident that he just kind of makes a reference to, the Lord was angry with me for your sakes. Was he blaming them? Like you did bad and he was angry at me? Or is he saying, His anger directed toward me was for your benefit. You see that? I think that's what he's actually saying. So it stood out. It's kind of significant. Well, okay. So they they got into the land, got around Edom. Sorry, I draw it the right way. They defeated Sihon and Og and some Canaanites before that. These are big victories, right? These are Amorites, I guess they are, up in Bashan and down below there. So they've kind of like taken the whole Jordan Valley, those nations that would have controlled the whole Jordan Valley. Under whose leadership? Moses, right? And I have an idea that Moses is thinking, we're on a roll. I still got it, right? Even though I'm in my third half of my life here, 120 years old. I can do this. And so Moses repeats this story to the children of Israel. He says, then I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord, God. By the way, that Lord is Adonai. That is my master. You've begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or earth who can do anything like your works and mighty deeds? I pray, let me cross over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, those pleasant mountains in Lebanon. Moses is pleading to change God's mind. Did that ever happen before? What was his batting average?
1,000.
The Lord is angry with me on your account and would not listen to me. So the Lord, Yahweh, said to me, enough of that. Speak no more to me of this matter. It keeps coming up, doesn't it? Yes. And Moses even brought it up, and God said, that's enough. There's no choice here. It's going to happen. It's inevitable. Then the Lord spoke to Moses that very same day. Now we're down to chapter 32. The very day, maybe the morning. Saying, go up this mountain of the Abarim, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, across from Jericho. View the land of Canaan, which I give to the children of Israel as a possession. They're spread out all in the valley. All those people that he's gotten there. And then over across the way. And die on the mountain which you ascend, and be gathered to your... just as Aaron died on Mount Hor, and was gathered to his people. Because you trespassed. Again he says it. Can we not let this drop? Against me, the children of Israel, the waters of Meribah, Kadesh, and the wilderness of Zin, because you did not hallow me in the midst of the children of Israel. Yet you see the land before you, though you shall not go there. So, how do you feel about that? Are you angry with God? Does he have to keep bringing it up? How did Moses feel about this? I can't get out from under this. Do we have to keep talking about this sin? I thought I'd be forgiven. So, Mount Nebo is about 3,900 feet above sea level. I'm sorry, above the Dead Sea.
Hey, Marty, check your connection. Yeah, you're unplugged. The back.
Yeah, please do that. I'm knocking everything off up here. I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's back. It's back.
Here it goes.
It's back there.
Yeah. It's about 3,900 feet above the Dead Sea, which is where you probably started in the plains of Moab. Down here, he's climbing up to here, right? And so from up there, you can see the Israelite nation. And I won't cover it, but I'll just remind you the story of Balak, who hired Balaam to curse the people, who was struggling to get that done. And Balak said, why don't you go up to Mount Nebo and take a look? And that should frighten you enough to maybe get your courage up to curse them. Of course, you know how that turned out. But anyway, that's the same place. A nice viewpoint of all of that. And so he saw the Israelite nation, and he saw a God's eye view of Canaan. A God's eye view. I wonder what that would include. Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev or the south, the plain. Wait. Is that what they were? Was he looking at Naphtali and Dan and Judah? Is that what he saw? Or was he seeing the Hivites and the Jebusites and the Canaanites and the stalactites. Right? I mean, you know what I mean? What was he actually seeing? He wasn't seeing the tribes of Israel in the promised land, but God is saying, yeah, this is what you're looking at. Right? Up there, that's where Naphtali will be. Right? Down there, that's Judah, around Jerusalem. And again, I'm going to speculate a little bit more because God spoke to Moses mouth to mouth and not in dark sayings. And I wonder if he wasn't saying to him, you see that lake up there? There's going to be a man come, he will walk on that water. Right? And you see that snow-capped mountain way up in the north? Moses, you actually might appear on that mountain one day. Right? And you see that bump over there? Kind of Moriah, Jerusalem, you know, where you talked about Melchizedek before. Something big's going to happen there. And you see those green fields up there in the north? There'll be a lot of teaching. It'll be similar to the way you've talked to people and dealt with them, you know, and all their unruliness and so on. You see what I'm getting at? I think what Moses saw was the bigger picture of God's plan. Now, Moses was in the third half of his life, 40 years. How does that compare to the plan God was showing him there, in terms of time, in terms of magnitude? Moses said, oh, I just need to help him take Canaan. Well, okay. How much of the plan really was that? I think maybe God showed him a bigger picture. And if you see the bigger picture, then suddenly you realize, what's my part in that? It's just a few years, a breath or a sigh, and it's gone like a dream. So I think that's right. All right, so Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. By the way, that's a little different word. It's the mouth word, the breath of the Lord. The rabbis have this kind of a tradition that somehow God breathed on Moses and that's when he died, which gives some meaning to that peh el peh thing, you know, like mouth to mouth. And he buried him in the valley land of Moab. Moses was 120 when he died. His eyes were not dim, his natural vigor diminished. The children of Israel wept for in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of Moses' mourning ended. Okay? Here's some observations. His last day, knowing it was his last day, was filled with activities for others. You see, I hope you saw that. The other thing that hurts me somewhat is there was stern language from Jehovah. I mean, there was no sympathy. Moses went up there by himself. He didn't go up with his wife and sons to say goodbye. He just went up the mountain by himself, and that was it. And there wasn't a lot of sentimentality or reminiscing or eulogizing. God says enough of that. Don't talk about that anymore. And that's at the very end. No companionship, limited period of mourning, 30 days, done. God appears to Joshua. Newsflash, Moses is dead. Get up, let's go. But God's plan continued. It wasn't hindered at all. It was enhanced, really, in the conquest of the land. And so Joshua took over the leadership. All right, now we're ready for the third half of the lesson. If you will, take out, actually, your Bible would be the best thing to look at this psalm. And I have in the material printed out the psalm with the points I'm going to make about Moses and then the points I'm going to make about us and how we perceive it. And they're in two separate sheets. I'm going to try to show them together here for the sake of time. Are you ready? Psalm 90, the Psalm of Moses, man of God. Lord, and by the way, sorry, it's not too good. I get one word done. That Lord is not the Yahweh name that's special to Moses. That's Adonai, Lord, Master. That's the way he begins. Now he will come to that name, but it's in the third half of the psalm, the last part. He will come to the Yahweh name, but not the beginning. Lord, you have been our, what? Dwelling place in all generations. You know, Moses had been leading a homeless people. And God had actually was guiding them to their habitation, as we read. And Moses actually built the dwelling place for God. That's kind of the opposite among the people. And what was his tagline again? He's the servant, faithful servant in God's house. For us, homeless people, including me, We need to abide with God as our permanent dwelling place.
Amen.
And whatever house you think you can invest in, it's not going to last.
That's right.
If it does, you won't
That's
be
right.
in it. The permanent dwelling place is God, especially in time of difficulty and trouble and displacement,
Amen.
coming from a different country altogether. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Who wrote about that formation of the mountains from the very beginning? That was Moses' narrative. God exists before and after all of man. His wisdom and rules span all of history. And I think that's the context of all of our complaints. I've kind of mentioned that before. Here's our life. Here's our knowledge, right? Here's how much of the world we can see at any point in time. I can't even make my hands big enough, right? And that is God spans all of time before that. You turn man to destruction and say, return, O children of men. I'll just say that this return man, it doesn't mean, he says you turn man, it doesn't mean that men are called and repented. We hope that's true too, but that's not what this is saying. It's saying man was this and you've returned him to something else. Now, the lesser translations will stick the word dust in there because that's kind of the idea. I'm returning to dust, right? It's not in the text. But the intent of that is that I'm returning to dust, which means, in the end, who kills us?
God.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You turn man to destruction and say, return, O children of men. And Moses wrote about that story, of course, as well. News flash again. Death is certain for us.
Right.
For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it's past, and like a watch in the night. Moses wrote the history of thousands of years. And it seemed to me that must have helped him understand. We've been at this for thousands of years, and God's been managing things pretty well up till now. But for us, it's not very, it's more than we can handle, right? Or anyway, 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it's past, like a night watch. That's how broad God's idea of time is. You carry them away. I think that's I'll skip on ahead. You carry them away, and the pronoun there I think is referring back to the man who's returned to destruction. You carry them away like a flood. They're like asleep. That is, I don't know. Y'all remember how all the time you were asleep last night? No, I went to sleep. I kind of remember almost. I slept really well last night. But I don't really remember anything about sleeping. And I woke up and it was like that long. And that's how long our life is. In the morning, we're like grass which grows up. It flourishes and grows. In the evening, it's cut down and withered. Moses was in that very moment experiencing the last day of his life in which it would go away. And our lives pass quickly. All right, let's look at this song. This song. We're gonna sing the first 6 verses. And I'm going to use the tune, I'm Not Ashamed. In fact, maybe let's sing that. I'm going to sing I'm Not Ashamed, own my Lord, the first verse. I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honor of his word, the glory of his cross. This will be a familiar tune.
Yeah.
Maybe will be. But let's keep going. The song. Lord, thou hast been our dwelling place in generations all. Before thou ever hast brought forth the mountains great or small. Ere thou hast formed the earth and all the world abroad. Even thou from everlasting art to everlasting God. And yet thou to destruction dost man are terrified. You have set our iniquities before you. Had Moses' sins been set before him?
Over and over.
Yes.
The one thing in particular, over and over. And he'd witnessed God's punishment of those people whose bodies were scattered in the wilderness, to use the language of 1 Corinthians 10. Because of why? Because of their sin. And so I think when we look around us, even our own death, the death of others, the sickness, the tragedies, injustice in the world, I think one lesson of that is that that's the seriousness of sin that God is expressing in our lives. And while we complain, and justifiably so, when we're in that pain, caused by ours or others' sins, maybe the thing to see is God's holiness. And that is the consequence of the first sin in everyone's sin. I think that's what Moses is trying to say here. By your wrath, we're terrified. You have set our iniquities before you. God reminded Moses of his own sin. Our secret sins in the light of your countenance. No sin we have is hidden from God. For all our days have passed away in your wrath. We finish our years like a sigh, like a breath. I think that's the image there. That's how Moses was likely to be taken out of the world. The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80 years. Yet their boast is only labor and sorrow. It's soon cut off.
Yes.
We fly away. Who knows the power of your anger? For as the fear of you is, so is your wrath. Think about this. Everybody over 60, Moses' contemporaries, and a whole lot more younger people than Moses were gone. They're all dead. And I mentioned how many funerals, or at least how many people died per day. And I know some of them died in mass, and we, like Moses, should see our end coming. We're going to get to that in the third half of the song. Moses' work had been difficult. Do you think he had an easy time dealing with that obstinate people? I think it was Jacob that said, you're short and full of trouble. That was Moses' life, not difficult. And when we live long, I'm not sure. I'm trying to get over this idea that I'd like to stay alive a lot longer. It's getting easier, by the way.
Right.
When you live longer, is it getting more fun or less fun? If fun is our goal, which I don't think it is. But it may be more disappointing as our wisdom expands and we see the consequences and the decline in other things. And Moses' longer life is probably not going to be any more pleasant. And he would leave the people, fly away, fly away. There's an old song, I'm sure y'all never sung it, but Sweet Hour of Prayer. It fits our theme. Certainly fits Nelson's lesson this morning. The last verse in that, sweet hour of prayer, may I thy consolation share.
Amen.
Until, let's see, how's it go? Until Mount Pisgah's lofty height. From Mount Pisgah's lofty height, I view my home. You do know this. And take my flight and fly away.
Amen.
And shout. While this robe of flesh I'll shed, and shout while passing through the air, farewell, farewell, sweet hour. I know it's important, but it's temporary. Thankfully, prayer is imperfect, and our fellowship with God is what matters. Sweet hour of prayer. It's a nice song. That's the third verse. Anyway, we really are going to die. I've mentioned that. And God had shown Moses all of his power in the plagues. And I just listed some of those stories. Nadab and Abihu, and Korah's rebellion, and the sin at Peor, and the serpent, and Aaron's death, and all those, and more, and many more. But as the fear of you is, so is your wrath. I think what he's saying is the more we understand what God's wrath could do to us, the deeper our fear will be. And that's the measure, really, of how our fear is increased, is an understanding of God's wrath, or his holiness, you might say. Take out the song. All our iniquities thou dost before thy presence place, and set our secret faults before the brightness of thy face. For in thine anger all our days pass onward to an end, Moses was down to one.
Yeah.
And I don't think 1,000 days is much more than one in God's sight. He knew he was doomed, and his time was running out. He'd actually watched the clock tick down on all of his contemporaries as well. And our wisdom, it seems to me, based on this song, is based or generated by our apprehension. Apprehension meaning understanding of the implications of our mortality. Return, O Lord. How long? Who made the how long point? Was that you? Early. How on one of the other songs. How long? Remember that? What's implied in that? I think one thing is we like to have the map somehow.
Right.
But God doesn't live in our coordinate system. That's one thing. But there's an emotional feel in that.
Right.
How much longer?
Right.
I feel that
Amen.
more and more growing older. It's just, and it's almost, it's rhetorical question, not the right answer, but it's a question that kind of doesn't necessarily have a precise answer, but I'm just appealing in my, and have compassion on your servant. You see how we've turned the corner now to the positive side? Here's the ask. Remember we said a lament has an ask. What do we ask God in the midst of all this pain and the brevity of our life and the betrayal of others and the death and sickness around? What do we ask Him? Well, He says, have compassion on us. Satisfy us early with your mercy. Had Moses pled for mercy in the past when people had sinned? And even for his own sin, he had. Sometimes answered yes, sometimes answered no. But he asked for it, right? And in our sin and suffering, in our mortality, we ask for God's compassion and His mercy. Moses prophesied blessings and cursings. So he says here, make us glad, here's some math, according to the days which you've afflicted us, the years which we've seen evil, till we have some relief, some happy days that would offset those. That's what he asked for. Is that wrong to ask for mercy and joy from God in our life? Knowing that He may or may not grant that to us. But Moses asked for that. Let your work appear to your servants, and your glory to their children. Had Moses seen the glory of God? Had he reflected the glory of God? Read the next verse. And let the beauty of Yahweh, our God, be upon us. In the same way that Moses reflected the glory of God, he wanted his children, all those people left behind, to understand God's glory seen in His works, and also to reflect His glory. Man, thanks for coming in so quiet. That's amazing. And you know what? You're here for the best part of the sermon. There won't be a fourth half, I promise. And let the beauty of Yahweh our God be upon us. I just think of Moses reflecting God's glory, both physically and, of course, morally as well. And then I think about Moses leaving right on the verge of conquering the promised land. He got the people right there. It was right across the river. He could see it literally. That's it. Whatever we're going to accomplish in this life, rearing our children, helping some church, spreading the gospel somewhere, you know how big that is in God's plan. And who establishes the significance of that little piece of work? As unfinished as it is. Moses was blessed to know how unfinished his work was. But I think he was also given a vision of how enormous God's plan was. It was going to happen whether he stayed around or not. And I think at first I'm thinking God was kind of mean to him, I don't think so. Seeing God's plan, the way Moses saw it, understanding his place in it, how small it actually was, that was an act of grace from God. To let him deal with the difficulties that he had. And so Moses finishes by saying, and establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. Who's really doing this work? What did Moses actually do? God did it in his life. Well, we need to see our work that way. And understand the significance of our lives, as smart as we think we are, and as clever and as much work as we think we've accomplished. No, God establishes it. And we'll leave it unfinished no matter what we do. But He'll make His plan happen no matter what. And you know what? It didn't matter that Moses died. It didn't affect that plan at all. It was probably part of God's enormous plan. I'm starting in verse 12 in the song, and then we'll be finished. Oh, teach thou us to think upon and number all our days, that we may bring unto thee a heart confirmed in wisdom's ways. Turn yet again to us, O Lord, how long the shouting be? Let it prevent me now from those thy servants are to thee. Each morning with thy kindly grace, us early satisfy, that we may shout for joy and sing as all our days pass by. According as the days have been, wherein we grief have had, the years wherein we ill have seen, now do thou make us glad. Thy work unto thy servants done, again make them to see, and let thy majesty and power upon their children be. So let the beauty of the Lord our God upon us rest. Our handiworks establish thou, our work by thee be blessed. Sing with me. Lord, give us such a faith as this. Ready? Lord, give us such a faith as this. And then whatever may come. And then whatever may come. We'll taste even here the hallowed bliss. We'll taste even here the hallowed bliss of an eternal home. Of an eternal home. Amen. Thank you, brother.
We'll take 10 minutes and we'll sit back down together at